Hello, everyone who is joining us. We're delighted to have you. We're going to give it about a minute to let everybody come in and get comfortable. We hope everyone is having a good day. So the chat room is going already. All right, we'll go ahead and start. And folks are still coming in, but we'll go ahead and because we're sensitive to the fact that everybody's on their lunch break right now. Welcome. My name is Kirk Kernut. I'm the executive director of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society, and we are delighted to welcome you to our second session, but our first academic session of what we are calling Fitzgerald Summer School. I would just like to mention, and we will post the link here in the chat very shortly, that we have a number of other programs coming up through July 14th. And our next one after this great session will be on Sunday, June 20th at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And that will be on Fitzgerald and Race, featuring Anne Margaret Daniel, Michael Nolan, and the great eminent biographer Arnold Rampersad. So we're very excited about that conversation. We're really excited about This is a Magazine, F. Scott Fitzgerald in the American Periodical World. And I'm going to introduce our moderator for this session. And then I am going to kick back and learn and absorb from all our great speakers this afternoon. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jennifer Nolan, who is a member of the board of directors of the F. Scott Fitzgerald Society. She was program director of our conference 4 years ago, the 14th International Conference in St. Paul, Minnesota. Dr. Nolan's research falls at the intersection of two interrelated domains, 20th century American literature and periodical studies. Her scholarship focuses on Fitzgerald, of course, the short story and illustration, with particular emphasis on the cultural, historical, editorial, and visual context of popular American magazines in the first half of the 20th century. She received her PhD in American Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park, and teaches courses that incorporate interdisciplinary methods to explore 20th century US literature, art, and cultures. And I mentioned this on Sunday, but I'll just mention it again. We owe Jennifer a great debt for reminding us in Fitzgerald studies of the importance of Fitzgerald's magazine career. She's done at least 3 very important articles on The Rich Boy, Bernice Bobs Her Hair, and Babylon Revisited that dramatize those contexts. And she, in addition to Fitzgerald, she's published on Langston Hughes and has a piece coming on P.D. James, so very diverse in the magazine world. So, Dr. Nolan, I'm just going to turn it over to you and say thank you very much for organizing this particular session.
Thank you, Kirk. So as Kirk said, the idea for this panel arose from my own work and literature published in popular magazines during the interwar era. And with me today, I have three eminent researchers, scholars, who I'd like to introduce at this point. First, we have Bryant Mangum, professor of English at Virginia Commonwealth University, whose book, A Fortune Yet, Money and the Art of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Short Stories, remains the consummate work on Fitzgerald's short fiction in the magazines. We are also joined by Barbara Green, professor of English and Gender Studies, and editor of the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies, who will tell us a bit about the field of periodical studies and the type of work being published in the journal. And last but not least, we are joined by Michael Weisenburg from the Irvin Department at the University of South Carolina, which houses the Bruccoli Collection, familiar to those of you who are F. Scott Fitzgerald scholars and enthusiasts. And he is going to share some of their periodical holdings with us from the magazine's most significant to Fitzgerald's career, as well as a few special highlights from the collection. So I just want to begin by thanking you all for being here. I'm going to start us off by talking a little bit about the periodical world during Fitzgerald's time, and then we will lead into a discussion with Barbara, Bryant, and myself about the role that the magazines played in Fitzgerald's career and periodical studies and the types of questions that it seeks to answer. So, though many people today know Fitzgerald primarily through his novels, or perhaps more accurately through one of his novels, during his lifetime, he published well over 150 stories in magazines, many, if not most of which, would have been read in far greater numbers than his books were. As many have heard me say before, I think one useful way to think about the role that periodicals and magazines in particular were playing in popular culture during this period is to compare them to our modern day streaming services. So, for example, take the Saturday Evening Post, which as a space toward the end of the 1920s, Fitzgerald was essentially effectively employed by them. Like Netflix with its documentaries, reality TV, sitcoms, movies, the Post was full of different sorts of materials. So you would have political editorials, nonfiction articles, fiction, of course, serials, illustrations, and of course, the advertisements that paid for all of this. And these different types of materials appealed to different members of the household, much like who would share the magazine around when it came every week, much like we do our Netflix passwords. In Fitzgerald's era, the Post was estimated to be read by as many as 10 million weekly readers from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. And much like streaming services, it was only one of many different options. So, to use Ronald Berman's phrase, there's the vast middle ground where Fitzgerald was publishing that, in addition to the Post, included Redbook, which during that era wasn't a women's magazine. It was, it focused primarily on illustrated fiction. And then, of course, you have the more erudite, higher brow, lower circulation, and lower paying Smart Set. And then outside of this middle ground, there were places like The Crisis, a key player in the Harlem Renaissance, the Modernist little magazines, both of which I will come back to when we talk about the Modernist Journals project. And then on the other end of the spectrum, of course, were the pulp magazines, places like Black Mask, where things like the Maltese Falcon were published. Fitzgerald was well aware of the enormous social and economic power of the magazines from the very beginning of his career. And in fact, the title for our panel, as you saw at the beginning, comes from a satirical one-act play that he published in Vanity Fair in 1920, very early in his career, about the magazines. That play includes characters like the Edith Wharton story, the detective story, the baseball yarn, the British serial. There are a couple of love poems, and standing in for Fitzgerald's own work, perhaps, the little story without a family whose, quote, illustrations cost more than she did. And for people who have read my work, we know that that was actually quite common for Fitzgerald early in his career, including with Bernice Bobs her hair. So our program will start with a conversation, as I said, between Bryant, Barbara, and myself, considering the role these magazines played in Fitzgerald's career and the culture more broadly, and exploring the field of periodical studies, which addresses these questions. And then Michael and I are going to highlight both digital and physical resources for this type of work in the second half of our program. So to start us off, Bryant, could you help us to better understand the role that magazines played in Fitzgerald's career and how they contributed to his financial livelihood, his novels, and his reputation?
Well, the short answer to the financial angle, how the magazines contributed to his financial livelihood, is that they contributed the lion's share of money to the running of the Fitzgerald household. But I thought that a conversation that he had with Harold Ober back early throws light on the way Fitzgerald viewed the financial angle of the stories. And this comes in a letter exchange with Harold Ober, his literary agent. And some of you will certainly recognize what Fitzgerald says in regard to this, but the conversation was involved the fact that Fitzgerald had sent Ober The Diamond Big as the Ritz to sell, hopefully to a magazine that paid a lot of money. Ober was having a really difficult time selling that Diamond Big as the Ritz. But at the same time, Fitzgerald had sent him the story, The Popular Girl, and the Post snapped it up for $1,500. And at that point, Fitzgerald realized that he was going to have to essentially give away the Diamond Big as the Ritz for $300 to the Smart Set. And I think at that point, and we're talking about February or March of 1922, I think Fitzgerald came to a conclusion about what he needed to do in order to have, his writings support the lifestyle that he and Zelda were accustomed to and wanted first 2 years of their married life. And here's what he said to Harold Ober. And this is a phrase that I know a lot of you will be familiar with. He said, "By God and Lorimer, I'll make a fortune. I'm going to make a fortune yet." This comment seems like to me is both prophetic and it's also sort of ironic, because on the one hand, by 1936, Fitzgerald had made what is essentially a fortune when you actually factor in how much a dollar in 1921, 22, 23, what it would purchase in the present day. It's a huge fortune. But at any rate, what he essentially learned, I think, was that he could write stories that were saleable to high paying magazines. And he, from that point on, in fact, did earn for himself a small fortune. That's the kind of prophetic part, because by 1936, Fitzgerald had earned about $349,000, a little bit upwards of that, through all of his writing, and only $79,000 of that was actually from book royalties. So that leaves a whole lot for the magazines to have paid. It's true that movie rights actually figured into it, but at any rate, so that's the prophetic part. The ironic part, it seems like to me, is that Fitzgerald made this comment in 1922, and 1922 was, in fact, the last year that Fitzgerald's earnings from book royalties exceeded his earnings from short stories, sale of short stories. So in one sense, you can see that in, kind of almost a lifetime, 1919 to 1936. Fitzgerald had actually learned how to use the magazines. The fact is that even I think it probably was around 1936 that Harold Ober could certify to the Internal Revenue that Service that Fitzgerald was an actual employee of the Saturday Evening Post. And between 1925, 1926 onward to 1934, Fitzgerald basically was an employee of the Post, and he was making upward of, or actually around $4,000 per story. For example, Babylon Revisited was a story that earned $4,000. So in terms of Fitzgerald's overall earnings, the magazines provided a huge percentage of those earnings. Now, the other part, of course, has to do with the fact that he was making these high prices for stories. And he was, of course, a serious literary artist. And this question, how does the writing of these expensive short stories, how does it figure into his career as a novelist? Reasonable people disagree about this, obviously. And from the very beginning, reviewers and readers, but reviewers and critics were pretty critical of Fitzgerald's publishing these stories in his 4 collections of stories that had often appeared already in high-paying magazines. And this goes on. I mean, you can follow it through every single one of the 4 collections, and you see the criticism of the reviewers and critics. This was carried into this critical attitude was carried into the 1950s by Arthur Meisner in his biography, The Far Side of Paradise, where he said that the stories that Fitzgerald was writing for the popular magazines were creating for him moral problems that plagued him to the end of his days, and it kept him from writing more novels. This is a point of view that many people hold. I hold a different one. I see that the magazine stories, the ones that appeared in the periodicals, actually, by probably as early as 1922, Fitzgerald had learned to use the stories as workshops for his novels. And this is obvious for every single one of the novels, probably more for Tender is the Night than for any of the other novels. But there were 18 stories that appeared in the Saturday Evening Post that he got high prices for that cluster around Tender is the Night. We see him experimenting with themes and subjects, with settings, with character development in the stories that actually appear in the novels. So on the one hand, these high-priced stories that he was publishing in periodicals like the Saturday Evening Post and Hearst International, Woman's Home Companion, these stories served as workshops for the novel. I think when one reads through the whole body of these stories, one comes to realize that the stories have other value. And one thing that Fitzgerald wrote later, when he was trying to explain to Ober how he had lost the knack of writing Saturday Evening Post stories in the mid-30s, he made this comment. He said, "My stories are conceived like novels. They require a special emotion and a special experience." And he also said in his notebooks, he wrote this line that strikes me as really appropriate when applied to his magazine stories. He says, "Each of my stories, all of my stories, require one little drop of something, not blood, not a tear, not my seed, but me more intimately than these in every story. It was the extra I had." Dorothy Parker picked up on this sentiment of Fitzgerald's, and she made the comment that Fitzgerald could write a bad story, but he could not write badly. My impulse, of course, is to look at this question of, whether the stories interfere with Fitzgerald's career as a novelist, to really look at all these stories as part of Fitzgerald's literary legacy, and that they all do have that something special, and that they are in the end priceless. Now, the last thing I'll say here is that the question will continue, and I think we'll probably discuss this in our panel discussion, as to whether or not Fitzgerald, who wrote 178 stories, and now we have access to most of those, whether he would have written more novels. And again, you know, reasonable people will disagree about that, but it's a question that William Charvet points this out in a book called The Profession of Authorship, that when a professional writer is also a literary artist, he has to reconcile those two functions. And so I think this is what we'll probably wind up talking a little bit about further on.
Thank you, Bryant. As I mentioned at the start of our program, Barbara Green is one of the editors of the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies. Barbara, could you tell us a little bit about what type of research is published in the journal?
I'd love to. First, let me thank you all for letting me join the Fitzgerald Society today. I'm not a Fitzgerald scholar, so it's really a delight to be here. I do have slides. Would it be all right if I shared my screen for a second? And I will say to participants that the slides mainly provide resources for our conversation as we're going along, and those resources will come to you as a handout later. So you don't have to, if you see something interesting, you don't have to jot it down. It should come to you as a handout. So I will awkwardly share my screen for a second, and then I'll try to answer your question, Jennifer. And the host disabled screen sharing, which is not great. So I'll just answer your question. JMPS is a journal that was established in 2010. Our remit is 1880s to mid-century. We're interested certainly in the circulation of ideas about modernism in a wide variety of modern publications, from little magazines to slicks to women's commercial magazines. Basically anything that's published serially from the 1880s to mid-century we're really interested in. We certainly grew up around issues of literary modernism in little magazines and elsewhere, but we are very interested in publications that don't necessarily foreground the literary at all. We're interested in ideas of modernity kind of circulating broadly through the periodical press. We've published, for example, a piece by Shauna Ross on ocean liner cutaways, published in Popular Mechanics, a piece by Stephanie Brown on Sylvia Pankhurst's campaign against the surveillance of soldiers' wives during the Great War. That was those campaign comments were published in her publication, The Women's Dreadnought. We've done special issues on fashion in the magazines, on seriality, on digital humanities and the avant-garde, and on big magazines, on investigating big magazines. So that's sort of who we are as a publication. Yeah.
You should be able to share your screen now.
Excellent. Let me give it another whirl. All right. And someone give me a thumbs up if you can see that. Excellent. All right. All right, so this is JMPS, the Journal of Modern Periodical Studies. I'll say that we are not the oldest publication devoted to periodicals. The Victorian Periodicals Review, which is the Journal of Research Society for Victorian Periodicals, is older than we are. There's the Journal of American Periodicals, the Journal of European Periodical Studies, which is much newer. Each of those is connected to a society that runs conferences, so that can be something interesting to keep in mind. There are also publications that focus on print culture and steadily publish on periodicals, but not only periodicals, such as media history, feminist media studies, and book history. So that's sort of who we are. I will say proudly in this context, who we are is also, we published this wonderful piece by Jennifer Nolan on illustration and Bernice Bobs her hair, which has been referenced in this conversation. So if you're looking for that, come to us. So pause.
And could you speak for a little bit about what type of questions the field of periodical studies seeks to answer?
I can. So this isn't just true of modernist periodical studies, this is true of the whole field, but periodical studies is interested in thinking about the periodical as a text, as an object of study worthy of our attention, rather than an archive to be mined for those little gems that we want to extract, right? We're interested in the periodical itself. Sean Latham and Robert Scholes in 2006 wrote a piece for PMLA about the rise of periodical studies, mainly thinking about modernist studies. And that is, maybe the manifesto for modernist studies and periodical studies. And in it, they say that in the past, we've been too quick to see magazines as containers of discrete bits of information. What we need are new methodologies and new types of collaborative investigation to look at these wonderfully complex objects, as Jennifer described at the beginning of this. So periodical studies approaches help us think about production, circulation, reception of cultural materials. They help us think about material culture and the significance of what George Bornstein called the politics of the page. Periodical studies scholars generally tend to be very interested in what Bornstein called bibliographic codes, what other people call periodical codes, including such things as layout, cover design, spacing, font, all the factors of design, but thinking too beyond that in terms of circulation and production. Periodicals are composite, they're hybrid text, they're internally diverse, they're full of inconsistency and contradiction, which is one of the delights of working with periodicals. And they invite interdisciplinary study. Periodical studies certainly comes out of or is connected to any discipline that you can name: art history, English history, media studies, communications, journalism, you name it. But it also invites interdisciplinary approaches that borrow their strategies from different disciplines. So those are sort of some of the parameters of how periodical studies organizes itself as a field.
And in particular to the study of literature, what insights does periodical studies have to offer to our understanding of literature?
Yes, one would say almost any insight that you can imagine, given the complexity of these publications. But I'll say, just focusing on modernist studies, since we're here at the Fitzgerald Society and I work with JMPS, periodical studies gave us a way to understand the messy emergence of modernism, to really appreciate its messiness, to think about the debates that organized the emergence of modernism. And early texts by people like Patrick Collier, Mark Morrison, Ann Artis, and others really helped to begin to tell that story. Periodical studies help us recognize that the texts that we rely on represent only a fraction, only a tiny subset of the texts that were circulating, the texts that people read, discussed, and shared. And that is, attending to that, I think, is such a worthy enterprise. for modernist studies, looking at periodicals either very closely or through distanced strategies of reading, through digital humanities strategies, through computational strategies or mapping or visualization projects. We've been able to track some of the networks that organize modernism or that organize modern literary and aesthetic culture that we might not be able to see easily. And we can notice what artists, illustrators, writers, editors are connected in various ways, both nationally and transnationally. Periodical studies was extremely helpful in organizing our conversations about high-low, about the popular and the elite, the rise of the middle brow, the emergence of reading practices. And just to kind of sum up, I think one of the things that's so exciting about periodical studies is it helps us think about authorship differently. It helps us recognize that authors are working collaboratively with illustrators, with people who do the work in designing layouts, with the editors. Periodical studies gives us a window into the role of the audience and reception, which I think can be extremely interesting for literary studies. Readers are so hard to get at, and there are elements of periodicals such as correspondence columns and other reader-produced content that give us just little windows into reading practices or readers' engagement with the materials that they looked at. So those are some of the insights into the literary that I think are worth playing with.
Thank you very much. So Bryant, switching back to you, could you speak just a brief moment about what questions about Fitzgerald's periodical career, in your opinions, need to be answered that periodical studies could perhaps contribute to?
I think that, and I'm not sure if this gets right at your question, but it seems like to me that a whole area has opened up, particularly, and here again, I assume that this will be part of periodical studies. Jim West has brought this out in his editing of the Cambridge edition, that when works went, Fitzgerald, particularly Fitzgerald's works, went to the magazine, the editing of the magazine, depending on its audience, would often edit things out. And we know now for a fact that, a lot of the stories that Fitzgerald wrote had questionable things for a middle American, middle brow audience that were edited out. And I think that periodical studies, probably to the degree that they will actually look at audience as opposed to what the author originally wrote in the typescript, which I'm assuming, Barbara, that would be a part of periodical studies. And I think that that's going to actually wind up being an area that we will look at in Fitzgerald studies as much as any. It's a wide open area. I mean, we're talking about 178 stories Fitzgerald wrote, 160 of them published, give or take, published in periodicals. And I think that there will just be a wealth of information that can come to be brought to bear on Fitzgerald's methods of composition in relation to the audience that he's writing for. So that would certainly be one thing. And of course, you have brought out, Jennifer, in the articles that you've done, how important it is to look at paratextual elements that will actually influence the way that people read the stories in the magazines, as opposed to the way that most people are going to read them in collections, So I think that those are two of the main areas that are going to, Fitzgerald studies will go in that direction in terms of periodical studies.
Well, in tying that together with the earlier point you made, I think one reason for the story's reassessments in, say, the past 30 or 40 years is that you started to get scholars who hadn't first encountered them in the magazines. And so they were no longer thinking of them as just popular culture. And I think that that enabled a new look at them. But then the question is, well, what happens when we put them back in that space? So at this point, I want to segue into featuring some of the resources. And as we do, Barbara, I just wanted to ask if you quickly had some tips for new researchers in the field as Michael and I start to get ourselves set up.
I do have a few quick tips, and forgive me, I am going to try to, I'm not going to try to share my screen because it's been disabled again, and that's just a little bit of a hassle. I'll just say it. It's fine. So a few quick
Barbara,
tips are.
I just made you the host again. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead.
All right, so I'll do this really quickly. All right, screen sharing, good. All right, so strategies. Periodicals are daunting because of scale. You can't promise that you're going to close read a daily newspaper that was published for 50 years or deal with a weekly that was hundreds and hundreds of pages long and published for decades. So you need to set parameters for your study and really think about why you're looking at what you're looking at. That's one suggestion. A second suggestion is periodicals are just such an exciting resource for the classroom. It can be a wonderful way to warm up, to engage with the periodical, to give students a way of seeing themselves as researchers. There are great resources for teaching with periodicals, some on the Modernist Journals Project, which I know you're going to be talking about later, some elsewhere, and I have some links available to you in the handout, which will come to you later. I'd also think about the fact that periodical studies as a field is very self-conscious about its methodology, and there are wonderful resources that give you kind of how-tos that can be great for the classroom. This is one of them, Modernism in the Magazines, an introduction by Scholes and Wolfman. So I have some resources like that on the handout that can be very useful for beginning working with periodicals. And I'd also invite you to think about collaboration, which is something we don't do enough in the humanities. But periodical studies invites that because these are such unruly and complex objects of study. It can be very exciting to work with other scholars in developing a research project. Scholes and Latham talked about a humanities lab as sort of the ideal model for a periodical study. And there is a project available on the Modernism Modernity Plus cluster that shows what that looks like in real life. And the link for that is on the handout. So you can see how different scholars are approaching the same object of study, some collaboratively and some sort of in a side-by-side fashion. So those are some quick tips. I would say jump in. A journal like JMPS welcomes scholarship from people who are dabbling in periodical studies and for people who see themselves as first and foremost a print scholar or a periodical studies scholar. So that's my quick suggestion of tips.
Thank you very much. And I can say from my personal experience that Barbara is a wonderful editor to work with. So if you have any idea that you want to submit things of that sort, she is really, really, really great. Okay, so I want us to move on with this discussion in mind to highlighting some resources for this sort of work. And what we're going to do in this section is look at both digital and physical materials and think about some of the benefits and the limitations of each of those sorts. So for this discussion, I'm going to welcome back Michael Weisenburg. He's going to be our tour guide through the archive at the University of South Carolina. And I'm just going to briefly note that we are fortunate in that Bryant was one of Matthew J. Bruccoli's original grad students and was there at the, what do we want to call it, foundation of the collection? Is that our word?
Yes.
So he's just, yes. So if you want to just tell us a sentence or two about what that was like, and then Michael will tell us what the collection currently holds before we go into those resources.
Okay, well, I've thought about this since I knew Michael was going to be here, and since he's been immersed in the wealth of material that now is part of the Bruccoli Collection. Of course, when I began working with Bruccoli, Dr. Bruccoli, it was his first year at South Carolina, and it was also his first year of friendship with Scotty Fitzgerald. And he had been collecting some Fitzgerald all along. And by that point, what would happen is that we would have there were only 4 of us who worked with Bruccoli at that point, and he would have us into his study at his home. And I know, for example, that the chair that I was sitting in was right next to what I know is now in the Bruccoli Collection, Fitzgerald's briefcase. And at the time, I think we were all working so hard on transcribing letters from Harold Ober. We were Xeroxing the material from the original scrapbooks that were going to eventually become the Romantic Egoists. We didn't realize that we were in on the beginning of the Bruccoli Collection. But of course, I know that when I actually would have to fly from Richmond, I came to Richmond before I finished my dissertation, and I would fly down to Columbia, and Arlen Bruccoli would put me up in the study, and I would in a little cot that was beneath a self-portrait that Zelda had done. And so I think I took for granted, at that point that when we would discuss something by Fitzgerald, Bruccoli would actually just bring out a signed copy of The Great Gatsby or a signed first edition of Tender as the Night. And I think that we just took for granted. We didn't even think about it as the beginning of a collection. We thought about it as material that we were working with. And every day, 10 hours a day, we would transcribe letters. We would Xerox things from the scrapbooks. We would kind of just take for granted that we were surrounded by things like Fitzgerald's briefcase or Zelda's self-portrait, a few things like that. I don't remember whether the flask that is now part of the collection was there, but I just remember, and I'll stop with this, but the study was dominated by hanging from the mantelpiece was a big thing that said "For God, Country, and Yale," and then everything else was Fitzgerald, because of course Bruccoli went to Yale as an undergrad. So that was sort of like I guess you would say, the humble beginnings of the Bruccoli Collection. So Michael knows a lot more about how it's developed. I know.
Yes, Michael, could you tell us what it is now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating, Bryant, to hear that early history, because while I'm cognitively aware of it, I obviously didn't experience it. And it's great to hear that from a firsthand source, trying to imagine this stuff just in the Bruccoli home. I can actually see the briefcase. It's under glass. I didn't think to take it out of the case, but we do have all of these material objects in letters and manuscripts, as well as copies of the volumes of the books and the periodicals that the stories appeared in. So just a broad overview really fast. If it was written and published by F. Scott Fitzgerald, we have a first edition of it. We probably have multiple copies of that edition. Then we have every major subsequent edition in the United States, as well as many of the global editions. So before we get focused into talking about the periodicals themselves, Gatsby's been brought up a few times. one of the really great strengths of this collection is to be able to teach Fitzgerald from a material perspective and from a cultural perspective, not just a literary perspective. So using something like The Great Gatsby, showing the students the first edition and the little typo that's on the back of the dust jacket, and then showing them hundreds of copies of different editions of that same story with different cover art or in different translations, gives them a much more broader global view of Fitzgerald as an author and how the story is constantly being repackaged and updated for subsequent audiences and subsequent generations. It's sort of in some ways the inverse of what we're going to talk about today, though, because what we're going to talk about today are the serial and magazine appearances of the short stories. And this is a lot more focused. They're sort of specific in time. This is the event. This is the first time that the story appeared in print. And it has a very specific localized context that's sort of the reverse of what one can do with this collection. So the other side of Bruccoli's collection is looking at what he did, the work he went through to collect all these different specific issues so he could have every first appearance he could possibly get his hands on in the collection. Now, it's interesting to point out that the university already had some of these appearances because they subscribed to these periodicals. So Vanity Fair, Esquire, Saturday Evening Post are also in the circulating library, the circulating stacks, the Thomas Cooper Library here at the University of South Carolina, but they're bound in glorious red library buckram or black library buckram. And they end up becoming these giant tomes, these big physical objects that create a different phenomenological experience of working with the specific individual issue. So even though a library might have in the circulating stacks these very same magazines, the act of holding them, the act of interacting with them and working with them is fundamentally different, even if they're preserved in the circulating stacks because they're bound by the volume, not allowed to be in loose issues. So that's another advantage that the Bruccoli collection has, is he bought the specific issues. And that's a great way to teach students to think about the materiality of periodical studies, the way these would have originally been read and circulated and handled, and to think about the phenomenology of reading in that period. In addition to the print objects, there's also manuscripts, photographs, and realia, personal, ephemeral, and material objects that Fitzgerald's own that are also in the collection. And this lets us sort of flesh out who Fitzgerald was as a person, not just as an author. And that's another really great way to teach him.
Yeah, thank you for that. So at this point, Michael and I are going to begin by tag teaming, as it were, but sharing some digital resources that are also in the collection itself. Kurt, could you make me a host at this point so that I can share my screen? And when Michael is showing materials, you may want to change your mode, if you haven't already, to the speaker mode so that you can see what he's showing on your full screen rather than seeing the little squares more easily. But where we're going to begin is actually with a resource that's been mentioned a few times, and that's the Modernist Journals Project, which is, of course, instrumental for work in this era generally and for Fitzgerald studies as well. So you see on your screen there, that is the landing page for the Modernist Journals Project, and it includes materials primarily through 1922. On the one hand, the Modernist Journals Project provides important context for Fitzgerald's early career, and it especially gives a sense of the periodical world outside that middle ground where Fitzgerald primarily published. So you see here on the landing page, The Crisis, the magazine of the NAACP, which was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois. And it played, as I mentioned before, an essential role in the Harlem Renaissance under the guidance of literary editor Jessie Fawcett. It published poets like Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and it also includes many of the little magazines, things like the Little Review, so that you can get a sense of the other types of periodicals that were publishing modernism in the early 20s. Of equal significance for our purposes, it also includes the Smart Set. And there are two ways that this can be useful for us. As we all know, Smart Set is essential in establishing Fitzgerald's career, as Bryant talked about. So one thing that it does is it gives you a sense of all of the things that were being published in the Smart Set at this time. You can click on any one of these issues and it's there contained in full. So you can go through it and get a scope of the types of things that the Smart Set was publishing. The other thing that it offers is particular issues that Fitzgerald was published in. So here you see the one that Diamond as Big as a Ritz was published in. That of course is where our flyer came from. And they're very easy to page through and see the contents of the materials at the time. However, when compared to a physical copy, there are still some limitations that this type of digital resource can't really get to. And I'll hand it over to Michael here.
Yeah, so what I have spread out in front of me are a couple of different issues that Fitzgerald stories would have appeared in. Here is the specific issue of the Smart Set physical copy. And I want to talk about the format, the size and the layout and the way these things would have been produced and distributed. You'll notice that they are fragile. And one of the things I'd like to point out is that they're very similar to pulps in both their format and their production and circulation. Black Mask was mentioned earlier. I have a few issues of the Black Mask here that I can also hold up for scale. And just so you can get an idea that they're being produced on the same, and I'm going slow because I'm trying to be very gentle with them, the same type of pulp paper, the exact same size and format. They're being printed on basically the same type of printing press, and they're being distributed through this very similar distribution networks, although this has a much higher distribution and a much higher yield than Smart Set. This particular one has the Diamond is the Big as the Ritz in it, and I'll pop it under the overhead here just to give you a sense of, very specific sense of scale for how big these things are. And I'm doing this, I know it maybe seems a bit much, but because when you're looking at something on a screen, there is no recto, there is no verso, there's no depth to these objects. And it's hard to get a sense of how big they are or what their dimensions specifically are. And I find it really helpful just to throw a ruler on there so you can take a closer look at these. And we have several different issues in the collection, all of which are the types of magazines that Fitzgerald would have first published in. Here's a copy of the American Mercury, also edited by Mencken, and Absolution, his short story Absolution first appeared in this. And there's a very fundamental difference in the covers. When you think about how someone might be first encountering a story, right? From the American Mercury, a very plain sort of almost late 19th century looking cover, and Smart Set, which has very bright, colorful, interactive presentist art. And this is where Mayday was first published in this particular issue. One last thing I'll talk about with regard to the covers and the aesthetics of working with these magazines, specifically with the Smart Set, is the April 1922 issue of the Smart Set. Not only does one of Fitzgerald's stories appear in this, but there's a direct link to this cover and the cover for Tales of the Jazz Age, which is going to anthologize some of his magazine fiction from the period. Fitzgerald writes in a letter of that year, for the dust jacket, I would suggest something like the cover of the last Smart Set with girls and men instead of drunks, you know, like a Vanity Fair cover. And if you look at Tales of the Jazz Age, and if we put it next to Smart Set really quick on the overhead, you're going to see a pretty close comparison. So not only is Fitzgerald publishing in these magazines at the time, but the aesthetics, the visuals of these magazines are influencing the way he wants his books to be covered, illustrated, and promoted to the general public. So there's a pretty close relationship between not only the content of these volumes, but the visuals of these volumes as well.
And that brings us to the second resource that I want to share with you, which is of course one that we've already brought up multiple times, and that's the Saturday Evening Post. So as Bryant mentioned, by the end of the 1920s, Fitzgerald was publishing in the Post so often that he was effectively able to argue that he was employed by them. And the Saturday Evening Post has their own archive that they've put together, that they've done a pretty nice job of putting together. So here you see the issue that Babylon Revisited was published in. You can start with the cover and then just page through as you would have had you had this in front of you. And it helps you to get a sense of the types of materials there. You can see immediately from looking at this one and thinking back to the Smart Set, how much more prominent the advertising is. But there are also differences that aren't as immediately evident when we look to these digital resources. And so if we go back to Michael at this point, he'll point out a few of those for us now as well.
Yeah, so again, going back to thinking about the format, the size, the physicality of these objects, I'm just going to hold up for scale a copy of the Saturday Evening Post from February 1920, which is the one that held Head and Shoulders, which I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, this should have been Fitzgerald's first publication in the Saturday Evening Post, so his name's not on the cover yet. And that's another thing to think about when you're looking at periodicals is billing. Is the author being put on the cover? What are the illustrations? Does the illustration have any sort of relationship to the story? But I'm just going to hold this up for scale very gently and hold up the American Mercury to give you, again, a sense of what it would be like to purchase, to handle, to subscribe to one of these magazines, and what it might be like physically to read one of these stories out of these magazines. We've talked a lot about format, and we've talked a lot about layout and advertisements. So I'm just going to slide the Saturday Evening Post under the overhead, and I'm just going to point out that it's too large physically for me to get even a full view of it on the overhead here, but this is the May 1920 issue with the Norman Rockwell illustration on the cover. And at this point, Fitzgerald's getting his name on the cover, right? So we are now advertising that one of his stories is in this issue. And from a teaching perspective, these are a lot of fun because having students flip through them and have to find the story, but then also be exposed to the different advertisements, the illustrations, the layout on the page is very different reading experience for them than working with an anthology, as we've already said. And I'll just flip through a few pages in the physical object to give people a sense of what it might be like to start reading a Fitzgerald story, all of a sudden be interrupted by someone else's story. And if you want to finish the story you've started, you will have to flip through the majority of the magazine to get to the end. You're invariably going to see other articles and you're going to see advertisements as you go through. And as has already been talked about, the advertisements are largely underwriting the production of these magazines. And so this is the fundamental difference between the slicks, these big middle-brow, middle-class magazines that are popping up in the early 20th century, and the pulps or the later 19th century sort of literary magazines that are also still circulating at the time.
And so now we'll switch to our last joint resource. As I discussed at our last conference, and eventually we'll do so in writing, gradually the aims of the Post and Fitzgerald became misaligned in the early 30s. And this led to a relationship with Esquire. Like the Post, Esquire has a subscription service that you can get to that allows you, it's called Esquire Classic, and it allows you to access their materials. Unlike the Post, it's a little bit more expensive. So you can access all of the Post archives for $15 a year, whereas Esquire Classic is going to cost you $40 a year. But you see here the iconic crack up essay. And for those of you, some of you may recognize the image to the left of this from the Fitzgerald newsletter, where I talked about the stolen pinups that I came across when I was doing my work with Esquire. The trouble with relying on this sort of resource, in addition to the things that we've already talked about with format, is of course, then you're beholden to a for-profit entity to maintain these archives in a searchable way for the duration of the project that you are trying to conduct. So in addition to things like format, size, and materiality, it can also be nerve-wracking to have your academic research tied to somebody else's idea that they can make enough money off something for you to be able to finish the work that you're doing. There are lots, briefly, Michael will show you what some of the Esquire magazines look like. And then we're also going to switch over with our remaining time to a couple of highlights from the Bruccoli collection that I don't have the digital parallels to, because the digital parallels don't exist. So I'm going to go ahead and let you can segue from Esquire into those other materials, Michael.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. I'll keep it kind of brief on Esquire so I can focus a little bit more of the time on some of the other materials, but just to keep with this, here is the individual issue of Esquire that the Crack-Up appears in. And it's actually a series of essays that come after it that are anthologized by later. So he's beginning to publish pretty frequently with Esquire. Now, aesthetically, Esquire is a very different magazine than the Saturday Evening Post. It's a very different audience. And the content they're looking for is, of course, a little bit different. The material for the Post tend to be longer, more developed stories. Esquire tends to be looking for shorter, more articles, or the stories tend to be more like vignettes. They're about half the length of the types of stories that he's producing for the Saturday Evening Post. And of course, Esquire doesn't have the same financial backing as the Saturday Evening Post, so they can't necessarily pay as well. One thing I do want to point out, though, is I'm showing you these fragile, rare, unbound editions of these early magazines, but I went over to the circulating library yesterday and just pulled a volume of Esquire, just to also point out the fact that while perhaps you might not have a rare books archive that's close or convenient for you to visit, especially given the current constraints of the pandemic, or you might have a rare books archive, but they don't necessarily focus in modernist periodicals the way we do, it's possible that your local library or a library near you subscribe to these magazines, bound them, and still has them. So it's worth checking the AP2 section of Library of Congress or the periodical run in your local libraries. They might have the Saturday Evening Post bound. They might have Esquire bound. And while it's not the same reading experience as picking up the individual magazine, the individual issue, from a research perspective, it's just as enjoyable and satisfying to sit down with these big bound volumes and flip through them as opposed to be reading something on a screen. And some of them even have facsimile editions. And I pulled this facsimile edition just to help make this point that one can find reprints of these magazines if you're not necessarily into the digital reproduction, and still end up being able to read and flip through the issue almost as if it was the real thing. So these are also other resources that might be more easily available to you that you might want to keep in mind while doing your own research. I want to segue now to a couple of things that are unique here to our holdings at South Carolina. And I'm specifically going to talk about Fitzgerald's ledger book, where he records a lot of the information from which we learn about how he was publishing with these magazines and his relationship with the editors and his own finances and his own sort of look on what he was getting out of doing these things. We also can learn specific things about his relationship with his wife Zelda and some of Zelda's own publications in periodicals at the time by looking at the ledger, because the ledger is in some ways more truthful than the magazines themselves and the way they're presenting Zelda as an author, as opposed to what Scott himself is documenting as Zelda's experience as an author. And I'll finish quickly by just talking about The Great Gatsby if we have time. So here's the ledger. And one thing I want to show you before we get into the ledger book are a few examples of Zelda's publications in College Humor. And I won't necessarily flip through the issues, but here's an issue of College Humor. And what we have as the byline is a story by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald. A lot of Zelda's stories were being published in magazines either under Scott's name or under both their names. It's very rare that Zelda was getting her fiction or her essays published under her own name. But if we look in the ledger, and I'll be somewhat quick about this, we'll find that Scott himself is recording Zelda's earnings and giving her credit for her own work. So if you're looking at just the magazines and you're seeing issues of stories or essays being published by F. Scott and Zelda Fitzgerald, it's possible that it was really just Zelda's. And he does record several of these, how much she's being paid for, where they're being published, right? So he's got an entire page in his ledger book devoted to Zelda's earnings. And I should point out that we've scanned the ledger book and we've made it available online, and I can share that link later if people are interested. But this is a resource for understanding the Fitzgeralds, their life, but also their finances and Scott's identity as a writer. If I go to the beginning of it, what we get is a very detailed history of every story he worked on, when he worked on it, where he published it, when he published it, and then ultimately if it was anthologized into a collection or what he referred to as permanently buried. So you can find Bernice Bops Her Hair down here at the bottom. He points out that it's a short story. He talks about when he wrote it, where it's published, the Saturday Evening Post, what issue it was published in, was it reprinted anywhere? He's claiming it was reprinted elsewhere. And then if we go to the other side of the ledger book, you'll notice a bunch of them say permanently buried. Some of them say Flappers and Philosophers. Some will say Tales of the Jazz Age. He's recording where he is ultimately publishing these, not only in the magazines, but which anthology they end up in. You can do this throughout his career. He also records his earnings, and in the end of the ledger, there is a brief sort of autobiographical memoir. This is the line for The Great Gatsby. Talks about when he produced it. He turned down the option of serializing it in College Humor. So try and imagine reading The Great Gatsby first in College Humor. He turns it down because he was already behind on the work. He was worried about delaying its publication. It does eventually get serialized, though, in Famous Stories magazines, which is a pulp, and it was later reprinted in the newspapers. I'm just pausing for a moment on the section on Gatsby because it's the most detailed and well-developed section because of all of its different adaptations and because of the different serializations he does with it. So on that note, I will very quickly transition to talking about Gatsby and some of its serialization, because it's an example of him taking one of the novels, and again, this is sort of the reverse of what we've been talking about earlier, him taking one of his novels and then repackaging it later for the magazine market, and in one case for the newspaper market. So we keep this one in a nice buckram box. But this is Famous Stories magazine. And again, if I hold it up, I'll just pull out the first two issues in the interest of time. It's a pulp format. It's being published a little bit after the original publication. It's a year later in 1926. Gatsby's being serialized in 5 different issues of Famous Stories magazine. So if one is browsing the pulp section of the local newsstand or happen to subscribe to this pulp, one might end up with The Great Gatsby as a reading option. So it starts with the lead. F. Scott Fitzgerald's name is very prominent on the cover. And then it will slowly get deeper and deeper into the magazine itself as it's serialized. So it starts out as the lead story, and each subsequent issue, it gets deeper and deeper into the magazine itself when one is reading this. So another way of thinking about how to read it and where it exists in the magazine itself and all of the different ads that are coming along with it. I will point out that it is also illustrated. And so thinking about the different adaptations of Gatsby over time, seeing the way it would have been initially illustrated in the 20s and later in the 30s, and getting an idea as to what the illustrator thought we should think of when we think of Gatsby, Nick, Daisy, Jordan, and the rest of the cast of the novel is sort of an interesting thing, and it's really quite illuminating for students. The last thing I'll show very quick is a newspaper syndication of Gatsby. Calling it a serial isn't really accurate because we get the entire novel in a supplement to the newspaper, and this is in the 1937. This is for the Philadelphia Inquirer, but it was also republished in Chicago as well, and it's under Mylar, so I know there's some glare. I'll put it on the overhead in a second. But just imagine subscribing to the newspaper and subscribing to the Sunday supplement along with your Sunday funnies. You might get the entire novel of The Great Gatsby a little over 10 years after it was first published, along with your newspaper subscription. And so this is how another way in which people would have been exposed to or possibly read the novel long after it was first published, and without necessarily asking to read this specific novel, right? The Sunday novel would come complete in each issue. Each week you get another novel. And we have a color illustrated edition of The Great Gatsby, and it is complete in newspaper format. I won't flip through the whole thing, but I'll just go through a few pages so you can see what it looks like. And just think about the experience of reading the novel as a newspaper as opposed to a physical book. And with that, I'll pause because I want to be mindful of time, and I know that there might be time for Q&A.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Yeah.
I just want to take a moment and say thank you to all of the contributors. I feel like there is so much to do with periodical studies, periodicals, and Fitzgerald's career that we've barely scratched the surface, but that we have brought up a lot of interesting things to think further about. And I really appreciate everybody for agreeing to come and contribute to this and to help us kick off our Fitzgerald Summer School. So with that, Kirk, do you have anything you would like to say at this point?
Sure, thank you. Well, I just want to say thank you to all four of you. This was phenomenal. And I know I speak for many collectors out there that a lot of those issues like Famous Story and the magazine supplement are just almost impossible to find on if you're looking around in eBay or A-Books or any of those types of places. We do have some questions, and I would like to just quickly go through these. So any of you, if you'll just jump in and ask them. Barbara, we did have one person ask if the journal is interested in articles about European modernists. So and I'm assuming that means
Yes.
European journals as well. So
Yeah, yes, indeed. Our limitations are really have to do with the temporal span between 1880 and the 1950s, but we're also happy to entertain, inquiries. So do email me if you have some questions. But yes, we look at European journals and widespread.
great,
Thank you.
great, thank you. Very practical question from Michael. Are there current COVID restrictions on visiting the collection at USC?
So I will say we have been one of the rare books libraries that have been open throughout most of the pandemic. We do just require appointment only still. We're not open to walk-ins at the moment. So if you are interested, please contact me or Elizabeth Suddeth, our director, and we can help organize your visit to the collections. We're just trying to control how many people are in the building and who's handling what to make sure everyone's safe. We do ask that if you're not yet vaccinated to please wear a mask when you're indoors. I will just encourage you to please get vaccinated. But even if not, for whatever reason, we can work with you on that. There are basic restrictions, but for the most part, we are open by appointment.
Great, thank you. We had a question here. Actually, two folks asked the same question, and it's what was Fitzgerald a regular reader of these periodicals that he was publishing in? Bryant, that might be one for you.
And I don't know that we have a lot of evidence in correspondence that lets us know that. I think that there's that scene in Gatsby where we see Tom and Jordan. We see Jordan reading the Saturday Evening Post to Tom, And it almost does at least suggest that Fitzgerald is aware of how not only middlebrow or lowbrow or mezzanine read the Saturday Evening Post, but people of the ilk of Tom and Daisy. And my guess is, my thought is that probably he did not read the Saturday Evening Post regularly. That's my thought. He did, of course, when he got his copy, he would actually often tear the pages of his story out and sometimes use them, hold them beside him when he was writing a novel and pull things from them. But as far as regularly reading them, I don't think anything that I know of in the letters suggests that he and Zelda sat down and read the Saturday Evening Post.
Great. We had a quick question about the New Yorker and whether he published in the New Yorker. I think Anne Margaret is our expert on that, and I think she had to go teach, but she has.
Bryant.
Oh,
Bryant will know that.
Go ahead, Bryant.
He had a piece called Lamps in My Window, published in the New Yorker, but he didn't publish in the New Yorker because the New Yorker could not afford him. That was the reason. The New Yorker paid way too little. 1925, Fitzgerald was getting $2,000 a story. The New Yorker wouldn't pay anything close to that, and so he didn't even attempt to publish in the New Yorker.
And posthumously, of course, in recent years, I think they published the IOU and Thank You for the Light that are both in Anne Margaret's book. So they can now afford F. Scott Fitzgerald. But we have another question. Now, this one's a little more complicated. To what extent did Fitzgerald shape his stories for popular taste and make them saleable? So that's a pretty tricky question. Anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I mean, I think I want to reverse that question a little bit and talk about how, particularly once he was popular, the magazines would shape his stories to fit what they were trying to do. And so this is the kind of thing that I talk about with Babylon Revisited. As we know, it's a much more poignant and in some ways sad story than the illustrations for that would suggest. The illustrations focus very much on the Charlie who Charlie wants us all to believe that he is, and who he in fact believes that he is, but who I think Fitzgerald shows us that he isn't quite yet. And at that time, the Post was trying to sell the idea that the Depression was going to be something that we got over by sound business sense, and we were all going to be fine, and we should just start buying stocks. And so this really deep look back at the jazz age was didn't quite fit as much as perhaps they would have liked. And so I think they used the Paratexts, in particular illustration there, to try to make it fit more smoothly into the message that they had at that time. And I think we see that throughout the ways that the magazine does that. I mean, I know Bryant can speak to the language itself and edits that were made on that level as well.
Kirk, I'll drop a footnote to that. Fitzgerald actually learned how to play the Post. In those 18 stories that are basically Tender's Night cluster stories, they dealt with things that typically middle American magazines, especially the Post, would not have accepted: cocaine taking, abortion, and so on. And the way he learned to deal with that was that he would space a Basil story between, he would have a Tender's Night cluster story, and then a Basil story, a Tender's Night cluster story, and a Basil story. So he learned how to play the Post. I mean, that, they wanted a Fitzgerald story, but they may not have wanted the serious Tender's Night cluster stories, maybe with the exception of Babylon Revisited.
And I think one of the experiences you get reading the Saturday Evening Post, reading the stories in them, is you realize how in some cases a story like the Rough Crossing or the other expatriate story. They just absolutely blow, they just absolutely blow out of the water anything else in those issues. But then you get maybe one like John Jackson's Arcady or some of the fluffier ones, and they really are of a popular taste. Jennifer, a quick follow-up question for you. Would Fitzgerald have had any influence on the paratexts surrounding his story, whether that's the illustrations or the advertisements?
Not much. He wouldn't have had any say in the advertising. That was done in a whole different part of the magazine, and he wouldn't have been able to control at all what it was juxtaposed with his work. Generally, the illustrators worked also independently from the writers, and so the stories were sent to the illustrators, and they got to decide what to illustrate. They knew the parameters, so they knew that if it was under the masthead, there would be, in the post, for example, they needed to produce 3 illustrations, or if it were later, they needed to produce 2. Now, earlier in his career, there are some exceptions to this where we do have evidence of him writing with particular illustrators, but that's the exception to the rule. That's not the rule of how this generally went. And we do have evidence of other writers too, like people saying stuff afterwards. Franny Hurst writing to one of her illustrators talking about how well he captured her main character, right? And Fitzgerald had those kinds of comments that he would make to some of his illustrators as well, how much he appreciated some of the illustration they'd done, even bought one of the illustrations that one of his illustrators had done. Not very much is the answer, and it was pretty rare. And it was really Lorimer at the Post who got the final say in whether or not something passed.
Right.
Barbara, will say,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, speaking to Babylon Revisited for a moment there, I noticed there are a lot of people who are interested in teaching. And I will say that having your students read the Post version of Babylon Revisited, which is actually different from subsequent published versions, but having them read it with illustrations there is a very effective teaching tool, because one of the things they come to realize is that their feelings about Charlie are shaped not just by the text, but also by the paratext. And so if you're thinking about bringing in this kind of material into your classroom, that's a really good one, because all 3 of those images present a very particular image of Charlie that I think influences even a modern reader reading it in that context.
Great. Barbara, a quick question for you. Is JMPS interested in film fan magazines? And then for everybody, did Fitzgerald publish anything in film fan magazines?
My answer would be yes. We'd be delighted. We haven't done nearly enough with film culture, and we've done quite a bit with visual culture, but we'd be eager to look at that.
Great. Those are fun to go through. And Michael, I might just ask you real quick, that Famous Story magazine that had relation. Am I wrong that kind of had relation to, it was sort of like half a pulp and half a fan magazine, wasn't it?
Yeah, it has that sort of, I mean, some of these early pulps, you have a lot of fan interaction too, especially the sci-fi pulps. This is sort of a more general pulp. It's not necessarily genre specific per se, but it definitely has fan elements in it.
Great. And I think most of what he would have done in the fan magazines like Shadowland would have been many of the interviews that early in his career but they're still fun to see in their original. General question, what can we learn about Fitzgerald's short fiction in relation to audience from looking at stories that were rejected in his lifetime? That's a great question.
Well, there are a lot that are rejected in one place, but accepted elsewhere, like what Bryant was talking about. you know, that they would first try to the ones that paid better, and then when they were turned down, then he would submit them to other places where he was paid less. I know I personally know less about stories that were just outright rejected and not published anywhere. I don't know if you know more about that, Bryant.
The way it typically seemed to work, as we see in As Ever, Ober would write to Fitzgerald and let him know that the Post had rejected a story, and Fitzgerald would say, well, I'd rather not offer it to so-and-so. And then he would say, also, if so-and-so and so-and-so doesn't want this story, send it to the Smart Set, or let me send it to the Smart Set. So Fitzgerald was pretty open to anything that was going to bring money. And yet there was some stories that he came to feel very protective about, and The Diamond Biggest of Ritz came to be one of them.
I think you can also say sort of in the mid-30s, when he began to lose the Saturday Evening Post touch, really that it's kind of interesting that he began to lose the touch right around the time that Lorimer was being elbowed out. And I think that the Post was dealing with a little bit of a power struggle, in that different editors had different tastes. And I think that not only was Fitzgerald's sort of narrative structure sensibility failing him, but he just didn't appeal to that particular breed of author at that time, because even in the Post, the stories are becoming a little more hard. They're almost going two separate ways. They're becoming either a little more hard-boiled or a little more to the romance side. And so that it's almost like losing the general audience orientation it might have had.
That's actually,
Although you did,
go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, once Lorimer stepped down, it was actually Wesley Stout who took over afterwards,
Right.
and he was he had been the art editor, and so he was pretty much a Lorimer stand-in. It wasn't until Ben Hibbs took over in the 40s, which I actually talk about in my article on Faulkner in the Post, when things really dramatically changed. And so that was after Fitzgerald died. That was the early 40s when that big shift happened in ideology.
There are also stories that I think Fitzgerald did at the end of his life that don't get talked about at all, that are just out there, very experimental. I think is it Dearly Beloved, Bryant, the one that's written in the voice of the.
Yeah, it's the only story that includes an African American as the main character.
Right.
And of course, that is an example of a story that actually wound up as a kind of a Last Tycoon cluster story, because he includes that part from Dearly Beloved in The Last Tycoon.
Right. And I will just say, as on behalf of the Fitzgerald Review, that is exactly the type of story that we would love to have any enterprising young scholar out there do a piece on. Okay, one final question for Michael about Matthew Bruccoli. How did he convince USC to build a big vault in the middle of campus?
I don't believe he personally convinced us to build a big vault. But the idea behind, gifting these collections and then creating a situation where we can build on these collections. He and a couple of other major collectors / professors here at the university in the late 20th century. So Matthew Bruccoli, Joel Meyerson, G. Ross Roy, Don Greiner, they were all collectors in their field of scholarship. And so a large part of what happened in the late 90s and early 2000s in building the collections here, especially the modern literary collections here, was out of their transfer of their private collections to the university. And it's a large part of our holdings now.
Great, thank you. Well, we are out of time. There's a couple questions that we won't be able to get to, but we'll try to answer those via email for you. But I just want to say thank you so much to the four of you. This has been really amazing, and just the opportunity to be able to to see some of those magazines, even via Zoom, be flipped through is a great experience. I want to thank in particular Jennifer for putting this panel together, and just remind everybody that if you would like to register for our forthcoming panels, the link is in the chat there. You can just go to the Fitzgerald Society website. Just as a reminder, on Sunday at 4 p.m., we will be kicking off Fitzgerald and Race Week. We'll have a conversation with Arnold Rampersad and Ann Margaret Daniel and Michael Nolan. And then a week from Thursday, on June 24th, we'll have another panel about the non-Gatsby works. So those will be very important discussions for us. One final thing before we head out, just as a reminder, South Carolina has been so kind to us that the press is offering any attendees, any panelists, 40% off any books on their lists. So all you need is the code, and that is posted again on the website on the registration page. So go get your code, go register for the rest of the webinars. And on that note, I'll just say on behalf of the Fitzgerald Society, thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bryant. Thank you, Barbara. And thank you again so much, Jennifer. And we look forward to seeing everybody again on Sunday afternoon. Bye-bye.